Hello, and welcome to the Mothers of All Crime. This is a podcast where we deep dive into mothers involved in infamous crimes and scandals. I'm Monica, and this is Krystal.
Welcome back to the Mothers of All Crime. I'm Monica, and this is Krystal.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm excited to learn a lot this episode. We're doing something a little different than we usually do, where you're going to be kind of educating me.
Yeah, I think what we've noticed over many episodes, we've used terms like grooming and like how that affects a lot of the cases we talk about, yet we've never actually talked about or broken down what grooming actually is for people who may not know. Because it's not just telling someone that they're pretty and then next thing you know something bad happens. It's an entire
Hmm.
process and a strategy that isn't always easy to recognize. And I think it's important to talk about to give more insight into how these predators actually get access to children.
Yeah, I do think that's interesting, and I think it's one of those terms that you hear a lot, and it's in news stories and things like that, grooming, but I don't know that it's been defined necessarily. At least not like explicitly. I have a general understanding of grooming.
Yeah. So grooming as itself, it's a multi-stage kind of process that predators use to gain access, compliance, and secrecy from their victims. But it's not just for the victims, right? It's for the protectors, the environment, it's the overarching category as well. Um, and
Mhm.
they do that because when you go into a child's life, most of the time there's some kind of protector. There's a parent, a teacher, a coach, the community as a whole. So if you have ill intent towards them, it's not going to be most of the time as easy as just showing up in that child's life.
That makes
And
sense.
yeah, so in the first thing they're going to do is there's step 6 overall steps, right? So the first one is they're going to target. So the offender is going to focus in on whatever child they've decided that they want to victimize because they have vulnerabilities, they have an abnormal home life, they have a specific emotional need that that offender thinks they can kind of exploit. And they're going to start
Mhm.
on step 2, which is obtaining the trust of that child, the trust of their caregiver, the trust of the community. And that's going to give them access to that child and start to identify even more shortcomings that there may be in their life or their area. From here, step
Mm.
3 is going to be they're going to fill that need, right? So now that they've decided what the lack is, or they have the trust, there's a need there that they might have, such as they might not get enough attention, they might not have enough food, they might not have enough toys. So they're going to start giving them and filling that need, that isolated, specialized attention, special gifts, secrets. Um, and then step 4, they're going to start to isolate them. They're going to start to isolate that child and reinforce their relationship from a child's perspective. They're going to take away the authority that the child has with other persons. So they're going to try to break down and degrade the authority that their parents have, their caregivers have, and put a divide between them so that when the child
Mm.
needs something, they're going to go to that predator rather than maybe somebody else. Step 5 is going to be where that relationship becomes sexualized, if that is the goal of the offender. It could start small from just exposure to explicit pictures, seeing what the child's reaction is, and then they can advance that sexual relationship over time, but also sometimes it goes straight to full sexualization, either oral penetration, whatever the case is. But it that one kind of varies depending on what the predator is or their relationship or access is. And then step 6 is going to be maintaining that control. So once they have that, they obviously don't want it to disappear. They're going to start using things like blaming, threats, secrets to motivate that child to not expose the sexual misconduct that's happening. Uh, and then once that relationship shifts, the boundaries of violations and sexual violations, the victim often tends to feel shame and responsible for that abuse, and they don't want to disclose. And they feel like it's their fault a lot of time. Or if they did expose it, something negative would happen in addition. So, for example, if it is a father who's victimizing a child, and the father is the main provider for the family, by exposing that to the police or to a trusted person, father might go to jail. Now there's no income. Now you're homeless. So there could be a presentation by the offender of you can't tell anybody because it'll be your fault that everything else happens after the fact, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of steps with that. And it's interesting because there's not a class, right? Like offenders just seem to have this sixth sense of who they can victimize and who they can't. Um, they really are able to have this identification to find who is the most vulnerable. And as twisted as it is, it's actually quite impressive because there is consistency across a lot of these cases. Don't get me wrong, there's outliers for everything. Um, but there does seem to be those same steps overall, which for me is kind of
Yeah.
eerie, but it's impressive at the same way.
It is interesting because presumably this is not something that people are talking about necessarily. And you're right, you can't take a class or read a book about it. So it's interesting that across different cultures and people who don't know each other, that they're all coming to the same strategy, which makes me feel like it's maybe an inherent way to manipulate I
Yeah.
think that this is not just something that you see in child um abuse situations, or I think it's, it to me it sounds very similar to someone in a domestic violence situation where they're also going to be separated and made to be dependent on this person who's actually has ill intentions towards them. And I think that if you're separated from other people and your community and protectors, it's easier to become important in someone's life and hold a lot of power over them and use that as a way of manipulating as well. I guess,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, you're going to look at a lot of offenders regardless of what the fence is. If there's going to be some levels of consistency between them all, because like you said, it's easy to, once you have control and true control, it's easier to maintain compliance and get what you want and victimize rather than trying to find a new victim every time. That's a lot of work.
True. True. And if you're abusing your own kids or kids that you have access to, where when you have financial control over them, when you have physical custody of them, when you're maybe in a relationship with their mother, it's you have a lot of different factors that all kind of put you in control over the child being abused. And it
Yeah.
becomes really difficult to get out of a situation like that because it feels like your authority figures are the ones harming you. So where are you supposed to turn, especially if you've been separated from your other resources?
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you have the grooming at or isolation at a community level, it's very strategic, right? So it's looking at if the predator is able to get unsupervised access to their victim, they're also putting their place in a responsibility from the community. So if that child decides or that victim decides to expose their abuse, they have the reputation to stand up against the scrutiny. Where you have, for example, a really trusted coach. This coach has been there for 20 years, has brought back so many awards, and you have him or her helping children from broken homes ending up on full ride scholarships, or just having a very positive reputation, always volunteering, doing all these things for the community. And then it comes out that they have been abusing children over this whole period of time. There's going to be that reputation that fights back a little bit with the community and be like, oh, I can't, that can't be true. They would never. Look at all the positive things they do for children. They would never hurt them.
Mhm.
So by going to the community and grooming the community as well, they're really giving themselves that protection and trust to fight and diminish whatever their victims would say.
Yeah, that definitely makes it's kind of like narcissistic altruism where it's I'm doing things for other people, I'm volunteering, but it's strictly to make you look good
Yeah.
and to
Mm-hmm.
make people trust you in this situation. Because if it's like I'm the teacher, I'm the coach of the little league team, I'm the Boy Scouts leader, then I'm allowed to be around kids. I'm supposed to be around kids. I'm helping them. So I
Right.
think
It's
that
not
that's
weird,
definitely part of the
too.
strategy. Yeah.
Yeah. And if they have one on one
Right. I'm
time
not
with them, it's
weird.
not abnormal. Right. Because if you think about like
Right.
how many times you have one on one tutoring or coaching or whatever the case is, like sleep over at the Boy Scout leader's house, like that's not crazy
Ugh.
idea.
Yeah.
Well, now that we know what's come out with
Definitely.
the
I
Boy
mean,
Scouts, yeah, but like,
sure, but you could see how that wouldn't be your first thought
right,
if all of the scandals and horrible crimes hadn't come out about the Boy Scouts. It's similar to the Catholic Church where I mean, children were trusted to be alone with priests a lot
right, because
because
they are
they were
supposed to
looked at as
protect.
being beyond. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah,
Well, he's a
exactly.
priest. Who can you trust more than a priest? And it's like, well, maybe he's a priest because he can hide behind that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And speaking of disclosure, right, that scrutiny, the stages of abuse, the stages of actions for abuse is also interesting because you have engagement, which we kind of covered. They're putting themselves in that position of control over their victim for their vulnerability. You have interaction where that sexual contact does start. Um, and then you have secrecy, which is again that same threats or bribery or manipulation, however you want to put it. But then you have disclosure and suppression, and these two kind of go hand in hand. So, disclosure only occurs, it could occur multiple ways because disclosure doesn't necessarily need to come from the victim, right? It could come from a third party who accidentally witnessed something happening. It could come from the victim themselves, but it also could come from a physical exam. So, if you're a child and you're going to those annual exams that people typically go to, part of those exams is your provider is looking at your entire body, and sometimes things don't look right, or there's indications of contact that shouldn't be happening for someone that age. Um, or a teacher could start witnessing certain behaviors that are abnormal for the age. So, disclosure doesn't necessarily have to come from the victim, which I think is really interesting and very important. Where it's if you're in a position around mainly children, but also adults, because adults can also be manipulated, like we talked about. Um, but to see and know and educate yourself on what indications would be is important because otherwise it could just get passed by you. But you also want to be careful of what seems odd and what is experimental. And that's where that line is depending on the age. But the only way suppression tends to happen is through disclosure. So once the victim triggers the suppression phase, the authorities could pressure the victim into reporting and giving statements, right? But then you have their
Mhm.
personal authorities, so their parent, their siblings, their friends, who could be pressuring them not to report and not to take action. Where, going back to that father example, father's the one who victimized the child, father gets arrested. Mom is now telling the child to lie to the police because without the father who would go to jail, they can't provide for the household. And it would be, now it's the child's responsibility and the pressure of the entire family to not report and lie and suppress, again, suppression stage, what the original issue was and keep silent, again, protecting the offender. And those ones are
Right.
very connected because, again, you can only trigger it
Mhm.
by disclosure. If nobody knows and you never talk about it, you're never going to feel the pressure to suppress. There are plenty of circumstances where that doesn't happen. But that also could be flipped into internal suppression, where you may tell someone, but if it's not prosecuted, you could bury it down. It could come out in different ways of sexual trauma after the fact, leading to drug use, mental health issues, things of that nature. Also, are very common with people who suffer from specifically sexual abuse. Um, but it's one of those ideas for me that it blows my mind sometimes that you would have situations where someone's telling you not to talk about it, because I just can't imagine having someone disclose that to me personally and then telling them like maybe you should keep that to yourself. I just can't even imagine, but it's a very common thing and it is actually very well documented on the overall stages of child sex abuse.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword because it's like the child feels shame for reasons for multiple reasons and none of it's their fault, but I think that often the abusers tell kids that it's their fault, manipulate them over a course of time and make them feel like they're responsible for it in some way. And then it's only going to be a big deal. It's only going to be an embarrassing thing. Only the police are going to get involved if you tell anyone. If not, then no one knows and nothing changes and everything can just remain the status quo. And it's earth-shattering to report something like that. And now we're
Yeah.
dealing with the police and going to court, and sometimes a media thing. It's
Yeah.
a nightmare, but it doesn't mean that someone shouldn't be punished for that. And I agree, I think it's crazy. You'd think you'd immediately just feel terrible for the person that's dealt with this and try to get them any kind of help that you could and run screaming to the police, but it's not like that's
Yeah.
a painless process either. It's really hard for kids to do all of these police interviews and to testify, and I mean, it's another trauma.
Right. And I think when you're speaking specifically about children, people forget that, or not necessarily forget, but don't want to remember. Um, the majority of children are victimized by someone they know, right? So they're not strangers. And
Mhm.
having to sit in front of someone that you know and your family knows is even harder. So it's not like someone you don't know that your family doesn't know. It could be your neighbor, your coach, your parent, your sibling. These are the people that there's an emotional connection to. And even though their abuse may have stopped from a multitude of things. It could be that they are outside the age range of the offender's preference. It could be that they were removed, so they could maybe relocated. Um, they're not at risk from that offender anymore, or they sit that exposure to try to protect other children. So maybe it is a family friend who comes over a lot, and the eldest child was victimized. They're now, quote, too old, and there's younger siblings. So they might then disclose to try and protect the other siblings from the same thing happening. Um, which, again, so you have that mindset now going to police, now going to your family court, having to talk about it, about someone all of them know, I think is even more difficult than if it was a stranger victimization.
Definitely, because it's you're blowing up your family, your school, your world. Yeah, it's often someone who's very, very close. So their prosecution for a horrific crime is gonna alter your world a lot.
Yeah. And then you have the less reported ones of, in general, it's underreported, but even more so are those who are male and are victims. Male victims,
Mm.
specifically of sexual abuse, are extremely underreported. And it could be for a number of reasons. But for example, if you are a straight male and being sexualized, victimized by another male, you have that internal conflict of, a lot of them report feeling that they can't talk about it because they don't identify as gay. But if they come out and say they were sexually abused by a man, having that label put on them is something that they are concerned about, that they won't be
Mhm.
believed if they were victimized by a woman. Um, and you have also males reporting that they don't want to admit to it because it's considered weak, right? So I think this is, victimization and grooming in children is extremely underreported as it is. And then even harder than that is a lot of males don't even report it, of that category too.
Yes, I definitely believe that. It's very sad, but I think that there's a it's I mean, you've definitely heard before, like people say like men can't be raped, men can't be sexually assaulted, and I think that there are people who believe that. It just doesn't make sense to me because obviously if someone's, especially if you're a child, but even if you're an adult and someone's touching you sexually and you don't want them to, then that is you are being sexually assaulted. It doesn't actually matter. It's sort of like a made up concept that men can't be victims,
Yeah.
that men are always the perpetrators, I guess, but it's
Yeah.
just not the reality of it. And I feel like, especially when you think of situations with like a pretty teacher at a school abusing a boy in a class, a lot of the times the thought about that is, oh, well, he's a lucky kid. And no, he's a
Mm-hmm.
child being taken advantage of, being
Right.
manipulated by an adult. That's
Yeah, you
wrong.
get
And
the
only
the
the adult is
boys
responsible.
high-fiving. Yeah, the boys are
Ugh,
high-fiving and the girls are crying. Like that's the media exploitation of it, right? Um
sure.
and but also that's only if the teacher's pretty. Have you noticed that too? If like the teacher is like not attractive, like the boys don't want to talk about it. But if the teacher is
That
pretty,
is
they're
true.
like running around bragging about it. Um, Not that it makes it okay,
And
like you're
even
100%
if they,
right, but it is an interesting
yeah,
how the perception matters.
even if they are bragging about it or high-fiving about it, it doesn't mean that it's actually not harming them. Like it is
Correct.
still changing their perception of sex and relationships and women and authority and education and all kinds of things. It's a violation. And I think that a lot of the time, the seriousness of that may not be immediately felt, but I think in the years to come, it may be felt. And I think that there's so much pressure to play it off like it's not a big deal, especially with like adolescent and prepubescent boys. Like, oh, well, he got laid, so it's totally fine.
Mhm.
And it's like, so is he actually genuinely having that reaction or is he performing because he's
Yeah.
supposed to have that reaction?
Oh, absolutely. And I think people forget a lot as well that the result of any kind of grooming or victimization, physical, sexual, whatever the case is, it could come out during the process, it could come out after the process. It doesn't necessarily, it could come out decades later. And I think that's one
Mm-hmm.
thing that people forget is trauma is a lifelong thing. It doesn't just all of a sudden come up, and it doesn't all of a sudden just disappear. Um, as much as I think anyone who is a victim of any kind of abuse wishes, I think a lot of the reports that I've looked at, they wish they could just turn it off, but that's just not the case, because it eventually, if not dealt with, bleeds into a lot of the rest of their life, uh, from
Yeah.
anywhere. And it's too bad because of people just aren't educated on it, right? So you have
Mm-hmm.
different styles that grooming can take place, where it's really hard to identify these behaviors because a lot of them are behaviors of a typical adult child relationship or an adult adult relationship that in the moment you might not necessarily recognize that it's part of the style of grooming until it's too late. Um,
Mm.
for example, grooming styles, there's three of them. There's verbal
Okay.
coercion, which I think is kind of self explanatory, but it's the most common one amongst the offenders. This technique is basically where offenders are telling their victims with actions or abuse, and they kind of manipulate it as it's part of a game. They'll get a gift at the end. They're going to use their words to coerce their victims into compliance or participation or secrets. The second one is going to be threats and violence. This one is more rare, but it is where they're going to use overall threats or actual violence to intimidate and harass their victims into forced compliance of sexual activity or victimization. And then the third one is drugs and alcohol, which we briefly mentioned in a previous episode, where the offender may have given their victim a substance with or without the victim's knowledge or consent, right? And that's going to be giving it compliance. Very easy to take advantage of someone who is drugged up, drunk, not in control of their body, emotions, mentally there. And that one is probably the second most common of the three. But again, depending on the offender and depending on the victim, depends on which style they're going to use.
Oh, hey. Sorry. I don't know what happened. I think I hit the mute button. I'm sorry. I can cut this out.
No, I was like, oh, she's gone.
No,
That's
I
so weird.
didn't. I hit the fucking mute button on my mic, so like it wasn't on the computer, but I didn't mean to. It's like a touch.
Oh, yeah.
All right,
No,
so
also,
hold
I
on. I'm gonna have
wasn't
to
moving.
edit
I don't
this.
know why that was making noise.
Oh, I don't know. It was like there was just like weird little. It sounded like everything was very clear, and then all of a sudden, like a certain word, you'd be further away or something. Like
Oh,
it was
weird.
dropping a little bit. Yeah, but I
All
don't
right.
know why. All right, we could pick up where we were. Sorry. What was the
Yep.
third one?
Uh, drugs and alcohol.
Okay.
Do you want to respond to that? Or do you want me to just keep talking?
Yes. So the
Okay.
drugs. I'm sorry. I thought the drugs and alcohol was the second one.
That was the third one.
Oh, okay. So the third one. So when
Second
you
one was
say drugs and
violence.
violence, there you go.
Yeah.
So tr- sorry, I'm gonna just pick right back up.
Mhm.
And now the drugs and alcohol, I think, is interesting because I definitely have seen in documentaries and cases all the time that it seems to be pretty common for groomers, child abusers, whatever you want to call them, to be providing alcohol to minors because it's obviously something that it's kind of difficult for a minor to get. So I think that
Mhm.
it's just another way you're making yourself valuable to the victim. And then it's also they're less likely to refuse because of being like less inhibitions because of the alcohol, but also because of that being the way that they get alcohol. And I feel like
Right.
I've seen that a lot in my life anyway, is like the creepy older guy is always willing to get everybody alcohol, or like the weird inappropriate mom is getting her son's friends all alcohol.
Yeah, and I think that's the version that is what people think about, right? Because that's the version of voluntary. Versus if people are thinking like date rape drugs, that would be a version of
Mhm.
involuntary, where someone slips something in your drink without you noticing, and
Sure.
next thing you know, you don't remember anything for like 24 hours. So it
Ugh,
really depends
so
on
scary.
the compliance and uncompliant, right? Um,
Yeah.
and it is really scary, and it's something that I think, speaking like personal experience, you don't really think about any of that kind of stuff until you're like going to college, or you're going and you get told like, hey, like never leave your drink by itself, or you finally turn 21 and you're going to a bar. Like it's not something that as a younger person you get made aware of. And it's a double-edged sword, right? Like you don't want to expose people and children to things that they don't need to be exposed to, but also that, okay, don't take things from strangers is like the watered down version of that, right?
Mm, yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, you always think about it in like a club or a bar situation, but I know that that's also something that child abusers use, and I've seen things where like Benadryl and things like that have been used as well, just because it's something that will make you drowsy,
Mhm.
and so then you're just more compliant. It doesn't necessarily have
Yeah.
to be a roofie.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of different cocktails out there that sometimes come up on tests. So like if you end up in the hospital, some of them
Mm,
come up, but then there's a lot of them that don't. And so I think that is one example of how offenders constantly are evolving and figuring out ways to enforce that secrecy, enforce that way around the law where it's, I didn't give them anything illegal as a defense versus
mm, mm-hmm.
giving them something more stronger, something like Benadryl you can buy over the counter.
Right. That's true. You don't need a prescription. There's no tracking. There's no tracing. Not really any restrictions on it. So you probably already have it in your house too. So you don't even have to go out and buy it. Similar with NyQuil and like Tylenol PM and stuff like that, where it's you could buy it anywhere. And you could
Yeah,
go to 10 different
exactly.
stores and buy it, and so you could have a big stash. And I'm sure
Yeah.
that there's all kinds of Reddit boards and internet forums where people are giving out these handy tips to each other.
Yeah, I really I hate to bring up the dark web, but there are
Ugh.
so many forums about it. There
Yeah.
is one thing that specifically child predators are good at is sharing tips and tricks and secrets. If you know where to look and you know the right person to ask, there is a plethora of information out there, and it's it's terrifying when you kind of start actually researching it, looking into it. Um, I'm not saying
Ugh.
everybody's a danger to your child at all. Don't take that way, but it's out there, and just because you have these people in your life, these trusted people, that it's still important to educate yourself as a person, as a caregiver, as a protector, as someone who may be in one of those positions of care. It's important to educate yourself on what the signs are, or what is out there to help support someone who may have already had this happen to them. Because if you
Mm-hmm.
don't educate yourself, you're never going to be able to help anybody else or potentially even yourself.
That's true. And I think that in the process of getting groomed and abused and how that impacts someone's, sense of like self-esteem, and it shakes you to your core, I think, and it actually makes you more vulnerable to that happening again. So it's like you definitely need to be aware of like what the warning signs are, what the predictors are of this, and what kind of behavior maybe is consistent with grooming, because I think that once you've been victimized, it's more likely to happen again, and
Mm-hmm.
it would be better for everyone to be aware of what grooming actually looks like, so maybe it's harder to get away with.
Yeah. And you're totally right. Once victimized, unfortunately, you're again, predators seem to have this sixth sense about them. Your likelihood of being victimized in the future of either the same crime or a different crime does go up. Um,
Mm,
and I think having that education is going to help you to try and minimize the option. Listen, sometimes life happens and there is nothing you can do sometimes to avoid stuff, but
right.
sometimes you can do your best to minimize risk. Um, it's nobody's fault if you are victimized. You are the victim by the sense of the word. The offender is the person responsible for that action. But I do think
Definitely.
sometimes helping and educating yourself or not putting yourself in certain circumstances can minimize risk. Um, and again, educating around you. So, for example, one thing that I was baffled by when I was doing research on it is mandatory reporting, right? Specifically in schools. When you think about your child in a school, you think they're going to be safe. You think if something's going on, that teacher is a mandated reporter and has to do something about it. That is not true throughout our country. There are actually 3
Oh.
states that does not mandate your teachers to be mandated reporters. And if you are part
Oh,
of any
really?
kind of homeschooling education program,
Mm,
there are no mandated reporters. So if you're like in a homeschool program and sometimes they have like group meetups or your parent is your teacher or whatever, they're not required to become mandated reporters. So there's a huge population of people out there that could be completely aware of something and not required to do anything about it.
wow. That's
Yeah.
crazy. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like that's seems silly to even have, like, I mean, the homeschooling thing, I don't know what the solution. Obviously, I do think teachers should be mandated reporters, and homeschooling I think leaves a lot of kids vulnerable because school is a safety net of sorts where even if teachers maybe don't have to report, they might. And I think that just having more eyes on someone can be helpful in a situation like that, because it's harder to get away with severe abuse if other people are seeing the victim. And I think if you can just isolate them further and keep them at home, I mean, it obviously depends on who the perpetrator is, but yeah, I feel like there should be something in place for homeschool kids, but I don't know what the solution to that would be.
Yeah. So there's an advocate. Her name is Misty Griffin. She actually was originally from the Amish community, which I think we should totally do an episode a different day on. um,
Oh yeah,
but
about the Amish for sure.
yeah, so she came from an Amish community, a very strict one. Um, Suffered a lot of CSA, a lot of SA, a lot of CA. Um, and she is now
Ugh.
out and has started a petition called the Child Rights Act. People can find it on change.org/Child's Right Act. And it's specifically for mandated reporting in schools and to help homeschooling kids in those circumstances. So she's taken her personal experience on this exact topic and trying to do something about it, because that's the thing is there is no
That's
change
amazing.
if no one tries to do anything, right? And what she's proposing may
Mm-hmm.
not be the perfect solution, but at least it's an action. At least it's a step in the direction of protecting children versus just
Yeah.
recognizing there's a problem and going, "Yep." like um she's very interesting if anyone wants to take some time, and she's been on a lot of podcasts promoting this bill that she's putting up right now. So very interesting
Yeah, I
if
think
anybody
that's
wants to
a
go on
great
there.
idea.
But
And I mean, if she thinks that that could have helped in her situation, then I think that that makes a lot of sense.
right, yeah. And again, the problem is what she's trying to do is be retroactive, right? Because there's a lot of things out there
Mm-hmm.
that are reactive. Um, child sex abuse right now is a public health burden of over $9 billion as a result of what happens to people. And
Wow.
thinking about that from a financial perspective, that's insane. That's 60,000 different children a year being victimized. And
Ugh.
there's not enough education for parents, there's not enough education for institutions, preventative, how to help people, right? Um, so, a couple other researchers just wanted to talk about that if people are looking to educate themselves, that act is really interesting to go check that out. She did a podcast with Celeste on cults to consciousness that I thought was really educational. Also gives a little bit of background on like her and where she comes from. There
Mm-hmm.
are safe touch programs that are specifically designed for second and third graders, teaching them what is considered a safe touch and an unsafe touch, the differences between secrets and surprises, and what to do in encounters of unsafe touching. Um, there are programs that are in the school system, which I think is important when you have that education. But there's also
Mm-hmm.
parental educations, right? You have programs that were designed, this a little bit of older one that kind of fell away, but it was educating parents on what stages of them are, right? What is a parent child communication skill? How do you talk to your children about this kind of stuff? Because I think people get
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable, right? Of course.
Yeah.
So educate the
Sure.
parents. And then another program that I personally really liked was it's called Stop It Now. It's a program that was founded back in 92 from a CSA survivor, again, trying to prevent trauma. They look at it as a community based program where there's steps on how to prevent education, how to give training to the community, increase advocacy, but also provide services for those who need help. There's a hotline, there's an email, there's chat services. You can be completely anonymous if you want to go and just see what's out there. They will talk to you without any questions asked. Um,
Mm.
there are a lot of sites like that popping up. Um, the Smart Parent program of Safe and Healthy Kids also won't ask any questions if you just want to get parental education that you can try and incorporate to try and protect yourself and your children around you. Um, Also, Darkness of Light campaign, that's probably the newest one. That is an evidence based theory program, which I am all about. Anything that has evidence backing it, I think is personally the best kind of policy and actions out there. Um, they've helped over 80% of children having a one time situation versus multiple times of situations of abuse. And their
Mm.
goal is to decrease victimization down to like 4 to 8%. Um, and because they don't want false reporting, which is also a problem. So they're going to look
Which
into,
will for sure.
yeah, those steps of barriers, boundaries, and personal bodies and how to educate them. So, just to name a few, if people want more information, I'm happy to provide the references for everything we talked about today. Um, but there are things out there, and people should know that they're not alone, and there are things that can be done before and after. God forbid anything happens.
Definitely. And I hate that people feel alone in this kind of a situation, because it clearly is something that happens so much, and
Mm-hmm.
nobody should feel bad about having been groomed or having been abused in any of these kinds of ways, because it is truly never the victim's fault, and it is always the perpetrator's fault. And the more that we know and understand about how they think, like, hopefully the more resources that we can have to protect people, the better. And if anybody wants to reach out to us about to get more resources or to ask questions about anything we talked about today, like, they could email us at themothersofallcrime@gmail.com, or reach out to us on Instagram, or comment on Spotify or Apple. We see everything. So
Mm-hmm.
we're available.
Yes, absolutely. 100%. Um, but that's everything I had. Do you have any other questions, comments?
Well, I think you did a fantastic job presenting this information, and I feel like I have a more thorough understanding. And I think that this is something that is just like helpful general knowledge for a lot of the topics that we have coming up. And
Mm-hmm.
we've been really talking about doing a Mary Kay Letourneau episode, and so I think
I
that this
know.
is like, it's perfect for that. Obviously, like, that's such a
Yeah.
classic scenario, and I think that there's so many other similar cases to that that just didn't get quite the media attention. So
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, so I'll be interested to hear all of your takes on how that situation evolved over time, because it is such a complex case of grooming. And
Yeah.
so I think that it's just really cool how knowledgeable you are. I don't know that I have any questions right now. But I think that's just because you were so good at explaining everything.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, again, as a reminder for people, I am currently working on a PhD in criminal justice and criminology. So I have been learning about this stuff for a very long time. uh,
Yes,
but it
definitely.
is uh, it is something that I'm very passionate about, trying to help the people that can't help themselves. I think is a short way to put it.
Yeah, and I think that's a very noble goal. And I hope that, like, maybe in a small way, we could even help with this podcast just a little bit, just to provide a little
Yeah.
education, you know,
Just yeah,
small
the more the
things too.
awareness that people can hear is so important. So I'll link actually that podcast with Misty in one of the comments somewhere. Because I do think it's interesting if anybody wants to listen to it, and there is a petition if you want to sign it. Um, no pressure, but
Oh, yeah. Send it to me too. I'll sign it.
all right, beautiful. Well, that's everything we had for today. A little bit of an education. And next episode, we'll go back to our Mothers of the Week.
All right. Thanks so much.